Chapter 4. I took a deep breath as the wizard jumped out of the way and put me directly in front of the hideous creature before us. It was ugly as hell, and all I could think was that these vampires really had a little too much fun with their macabre experiments. This looked like one of the most dangerous creatures I'd ever encountered, and I'd seen a lot of crazy shit from the vampires. The creature let out a startling hiss that made my ears and the inside of my armor ring, and then it sniffed the air like it was trying to decide if we were friend or foe. "What is that?" Imelda asked as she scurried behind me. "I don't know," I said. "But the vampires must have made it to protect this lair. Maybe that's why it hasn't attacked," the wizard whispered and glanced at Imelda. "It may smell a vampire in the room." The bear did seem confused, and I thought it might return to wherever it had been, but it sniffed the air again, and then its gaze locked on me. "No such luck," I muttered as I readied my blade. The bear lurched toward me, but I delivered a devastating overhead slash to its shoulder with my moon sword that exploded with a spray of thick black tiger. It lifted one terrifyingly large paw with bloody claws and brought it down with surprising force despite the grievous wound I'd inflicted. The bear's massive claws ripped across my snout. I immediately tasted my own blood. I was reeling in pain, but I raised my right leg and kicked the bear in the chest with all my strength to put some space between us before it could get its balance. I followed up with another haymaker slash across its torso, which opened a wound big enough for a small man to crawl into, and more black blood poured out. But the big fucker seemed totally unfazed by the damage I'd inflicted. "It may be a golem," the wizard cried out as I parried another swipe from the zombie bear's claws. "Eh, what?" I shouted as I drove my blade deep into the bear's chest in an attempt to pierce the fucker's heart. I was sure I had the bear dead to rights, but it suddenly swerved away from me and bit down on my shoulder, penetrated my armor, and went deep into the muscle. Blue-hot electric pain shot through my body, and I yelped in shock. "Fuck!" I screamed as I drove my moon blade into the zombie bear's guts. Suddenly, I saw a flash of light. The bear released its bite on my shoulder, and then screamed as it stumbled away. I felt blood start to flow down my arm, as the bear's teeth were jerked from my armor, but I could still use it. "What the hell was that?" I asked as I tried to blink away the stars. "Sorry," the wizard replied. "I was just trying to get it to back off. Can you see?" "I'm fine," I said and shook my head. "Sir Henry, if you can pin the bear in place, I will be able to perform an..." Before the wizard could finish, I heard a roar, and the bear returned to the fight. "Hold the bear in place," I repeated, as if it was no large feat whatsoever. "Yeah, sure. Just pin down the indestructible-looking zombie long enough for the wizard to do his thing. Easy as giving a cat a nice bath." I swung my moon sword in a long diagonal arc at the bear again and managed to leave a long cut along its right foreleg. However, the creature's eyes continued to glow with a lifeless haze that signified that he barely felt any pain. The zombie lifted its paw again, and I took this as a cue to launch myself forward. I raised my sword, but I felt a burning sensation along my shoulder. I also noticed that blood was still trickling from my ear down into my helmet. The blows that the bear had landed were healing much slower than normal, and I could actually feel my nerves ache with pain. What I didn't know was whether it was something about the bear that was interfering with my ability to heal, or if it was somehow tied to the warning from the moon goddess. Either way, it wasn't good. I shifted with the bear and brought my blade down on its shoulder. After 2 more quick strikes, I was able to slice off the foreleg entirely. The creature roared in irritation as it lost its balance and hit the dirt floor of the makeshift lab. "Rorschach," I called. "Yes, yes," the wizard muttered. But the creature clambered back to its feet before the wizard could cast his spell. The bear opened its mouth and emitted a ghastly roar that rang through my armor. "Shit," I said and shook my head to clear it. Blood continued to trickle down from my shoulder, and I realized I was going to have to get this beast down fast so that I could be tended to. The hilt of my blade was slick in my hand, and I had to really focus to keep my grip firm. But then I saw the bear's rear legs steady themselves, and I knew the beast was about to launch himself forward again. His mouth opened to reveal fangs the size of daggers, and then the shabby creature threw itself into the air and straight at me. I held my ground, and at the last moment I tried to plunge the blade into the beast's chest, but its three-legged leap meant it was slightly off balance, and I found more rotting shoulder meat instead of its heart or lungs. The bear smashed into one of the desks and dragged my moon sword along with it. I was struggling to pull my blade free when the bear at my face, so I raised my free arm, and the claws tore through the heavy armor of my gauntlet and ripped open my skin. I yelped in pain and frustration, and despite the slick blood, I managed to jerk the blade free while I grabbed the bear with my other arm. Holy shit. I was really holding a zombified bear. It took every ounce of strength I had left, but I managed to smash the creature in the face with the heavy pommel of my moon sword and then pin it against the desk with my free arm. Now, I shouted, cast the spell. The wizard took a deep breath and held out his arms. By the power of the goddess, I summon your light, I summon your safety, and I summon your energy, Imelda muttered to herself as the wizard's hands started to glow. The beast took another swipe with his claws across my face, and I felt another burning sensation on my right cheek. This thing was going to rip me apart if they weren't quick, but then a bolt of energy arced across the room. My arm started to shake as the energy blasted the bear, and at first I couldn't open my hand to release the bear, but somehow I managed to pry my hand open, and I stumbled back from the creature as it howled in pain. I started to hear hissing noises, and I realized that Imelda had said a few words in the vampire language as the light died down. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the dim light of the candle, but when they did, there was nothing but destruction to be seen. The charred remains of the zombie bear were splayed out in the middle of the small room, covered with the smashed vials of blue blood from the experiments. Many of the notebooks had been destroyed as well, and broken bits of glass covered everything. Hank, you're hurt, Imelda said in surprise. It must be serious if you haven't healed. I hadn't even noticed how much damage I'd taken until I realized that my body was burning from gashes and slightly frazzled from the effect of the lightning. I'll heal, I said. But the slice on my shoulder still hadn't healed properly yet, which was highly unusual. I was starting to feel a little scared that the weakened goddess meant that my healing powers would be waning as well. Come on, Rorschach said, and he started to make his way into the tunnel and up the stairs again. We have to get out of here. We have all the information that we need, and you need medical attention urgently. But I started to protest, and I realized that my vision was getting slightly hazy. Holy shit, what was going on? I made my way up the dark stairs like a frat boy after a bender, and I was actually glad that Imelda was behind me to help guide me up the stairs. I knew that if I fell, there was no question I would crush the young priestess, but that knowledge helped me keep my balance as I stumbled up the stairs. Hank, smell some of this, Imelda said as she held a handful of flowers up to my nose. I didn't know what they were, but the smell was sweet and almost intoxicating. I didn't feel completely revived, but I thought I could at least make it back to the castle on Casanova's back. The direwolf appeared as if he'd sensed my need, and he gave me a gentle nuzzle and licked away some of the blood before he sat down so I could climb onto his back. That place was horrible, I said as I waited for the wizard and Imelda to climb on. It did seem worse than the other vampire lairs I've seen, Imelda said. I wonder if it's because of all that blood they collected. Unbelievable, the wizard said to himself. Absolutely unbelievable. Well, now we have the proof that we need, Sir Henry. We have to get back to the castle, I replied. We have to warn the king. Can you ride? Imelda asked in a concerned voice. I have to, I said. Come on, boy, back to the palace. Casanova understood exactly what I wanted, and he started to pound the dirt as he raced back to the palace. I knew he was worried about me thanks to the link we shared, and the pup was determined to break the speed records if it would get us back to the castle before I toppled from his back. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, but soon sunlight began to light the trail, and the trees opened up to reveal the jousting fields. By then I was starting to feel stronger, and I could feel my skin itch as the wound started to heal. What a wolf! The wizard laughed as he gave Casanova a slap on the back. I haven't been on a creature this fast in years. He's of a royal pedigree, I replied happily. As we passed the arena, I thought back to how I'd won Casanova during my first joust, and I knew when all of this fighting for the safety of Lupercalia was over, I would be back to have some real fun with my now fully grown direwolf. I could feel Casanova start to slow down as the castle rose up before us, and I knew the pup was trying to decide which entrance to use. I wasn't sure myself, but then the king's private entrance opened, and I saw Dromgool and Another squire step out. Sir Henry. Dromgoole squeaked as Casanova bounded up the steps. By the goddess, you look like you've been butchered. Don't say that, you idiot, Sebastian said as he slapped his arm. It's impolite. Casanova came to an abrupt halt in front of the squires and nearly sent the three of us sailing over his head, but we managed to hang on to the direwolf's fur and then tumbled from his back as the squires took Casanova's reins. I suddenly felt very stiff and I wasn't sure I would actually be able to walk inside under my own power. I hadn't taken this much damage in Lupercalia before, and it was definitely catching up to me. Hank, Imelda whispered as she looked up at me. All good, I said. I could probably use a Red Bull about now and some of Sybil's concoctions, but I can do this. The king is still in the Great Hall, Sebastian said. If you'll follow me. I nodded and let the little squire dart ahead. I felt Imelda take my hand and some of her energy flowed into me, and I gave her a quick grin before I started up the stairs after the short man. Sir Henry, I managed to grab one of the vials for proof of their experimentation, Rorschach said behind me, and his voice echoed up the steps. To the Great Hall. That's good, I mumbled. Maybe we'll be able to figure out what they were doing with it. Sebastian was waiting for us by the door to the Great Hall, and he threw the door open with more energy than I'd ever seen him use before. It almost slammed shut on his face when it hit the tapestry and rebounded back, but I stopped it with one hand and then pushed my way onto the dais. The first thing I noticed was that the great banquet hall was almost completely empty except for the king, the girls, and a few of his trusted, decorated knights. The second thing I noticed was that everyone was so lost in their discussion that no one had even noticed our return. Ahem, Imelda coughed. Hank, Sybil cried when she saw my face, and she started to run to me. My goodness, boy, Greyback echoed as he stood up. Just what type of creature did you find in the woods? What happened to you? Sybil demanded as her eyes scanned me. Tabitha, bring my basket. What? Tabitha said as she stared at me, and then she shook herself. Right? Basket. Tabitha snatched the basket from one of the tables and started to run over, while Greyback guided me into one of the chairs. I'm fine, I sighed. I just might need some of your garlic butter, Sybil said as she removed my helmet from my face. I tried to grin as the king, Tabitha, and old Blueclaw looked at me and tried not to gasp, but I could see the surprise and anguish in their faces. Sir Henry, the king murmured, it looks as if you have returned from quite a valiant battle. He did, Rorschach replied as he and Imelda pulled up a seat beside me. We wouldn't have made it if it wasn't for him. I wouldn't have made it if it wasn't for you, I shrugged at the wizard. And none of us would have even gotten there without you, Imelda. We've made quite the discovery, Your Highness, the priestess said to the king. Our journey was successful. Yeah, if the intention of the journey was to turn Hank into shredded beef. Tabitha scoffed and Sybil slapped her on the arm. Honestly, I'm fine, I said as Sybil started to run the garlic butter over my ears and my wrists. It was thick and soothing and I still couldn't believe that it worked to heal vampire wounds. My little breadstick, she cooed just quietly enough so that nobody around us would ask what a breadstick was. Sir Henry, Greyback announced, your weakened state indicates that the powers of the moon goddess are not what they should be. This is symptomatic of the general state of affairs. Yes, the king said. This is a grave matter, Greyback. Our forces will be compromised if we cannot find a way to counter this. You are right about that, Greyback replied. Any knight who finds himself in combat during this time will be in grave danger. As for the kingdom's defenses, not good, Tabitha muttered. Rorschach, tell us what you found on this mission, Greyback ordered. Proof of vampire activity, the wizard said, and he reached into his purple velvet robe. He pulled out a vial of noble blood, one that had the label of a full circle on it. The blood was glimmering and thick in texture, and the deep blue liquid seemed to astonish the king, whose eyes widened and glowed with interest. Surely the vampires couldn't have methods so sophisticated, he said with a nervous laugh. It's simply not possible. It is possible, sire, I said. There was a laboratory filled with hundreds, maybe thousands of these vials, and it was guarded by a foul beast that looked like a zombified bear. We could only defeat it by electrifying his heart, the wizard explained. It was a lengthy process. The vampires have sophisticated magic, sire, as well as alchemical methods. But what of this? The king asked. Surely this isn't. The king waved his hand in the air and shook his head like he couldn't or wouldn't believe that the vampires had so much blue blood at their disposal. Noble blood, Tabitha declared as she stood up and then marched toward an empty cauldron. Oh, Sybil murmured as she followed after the noblewoman. The rest of us sat patiently as Tabitha vomited into the cauldron and Sybil rubbed her back. Shoo, Sybil cooed. Don't worry. I'm not worried, Tabitha coughed. This just happens all the time now. A shy-looking squire came up to the spunky blonde and held out his tiny hands. Lady Blueclaw Baker, he stuttered. If I may. Tabitha gave an exhausted smile to the squire before handing him the pot full of vomit. Thank you, she croaked. The tiny squire winced and tried to hold his breath as he lugged the giant cauldron away. Tabitha, Blueclaw said, surely you have a stronger stomach than that. It's my dignity that's insulted, Papa, she said as she swept a few strands of hair out of her face. And that makes me sick. That's my girl, Blueclaw said and nodded. Imelda shot me a look at everyone's obvious blindness. We still hadn't told anyone that Tabitha was pregnant, though all the signs were there for anyone who was paying attention. I shrugged, but it seemed like now definitely wasn't the time to make an announcement. Lupercalia was in danger, and while I was willing and able to protect both the kingdom and the noblewoman, I didn't want to put that burden on anyone else. Sorry about that interruption, Tabitha mumbled. Do continue. Well, it seems the vampires have been collecting the blue blood for years, I said. And it looks like they've been testing how the blood reacts to each phase of the moon. That's what the label is for. The blood is at its most potent on the full moon, and any night could tell you that, Blueclaw shrugged. There's tales of military quests hundreds of years ago that were always plotted around the full moon. It's when the goddess is at her most powerful, and when it makes the most sense for us to strike. But what about the opposite? I asked. If you're at your most powerful when it's full, then. I have never felt significantly weakened by the new moon, Greyback asserted. I might be a hair slower or not able to lift quite as much, but in most battles it's not enough to make a difference. Then maybe it isn't about fighting, Sybil proffered. Maybe it's about when the goddess is most powerful. There are other benefits to going to battle at the time of the full moon that have nothing to do with our blood, Blueclaw said. There is more moonlight. Of course, so we have better vision in a night raid. There's also symbolic significance to feeling watched over by the goddess, feeling illuminated, if you will, by her power. The goddess is never as weak at the new moon as she is right now, Greyback said. This is unprecedented. But what was the point of all these tests? The king asked. Anyone could have told them that we are weakest during a new moon. The only reason vampires would study anything that closely would be to find the best time to strike, Imelda replied. They would have been trying to determine if they could poison noble blood with vampire blood. That's not possible, Blueclaw declared. It's the only thing that would interest the vampires, Imelda said. And it explains much of the information we found in the journal. Only vampires would expend so much energy on a doomed project, Blueclaw muttered and shook his head. Except, I said, that the goddess is very weak right now. And if the goddess is weak, then so are we, the king noted. For a moment, it went so silent that I could hear mice scuttling in the far corner of the hall. What we were looking for wasn't just some ordinary phase of the moon. It was something seismic. We had to think way bigger than the lunar calendar because whatever was happening seemed like a once-in-a-lifetime event. I closed my eyes and thought. My wounds were starting to heal a lot quicker, since Sybil had smeared the garlic butter on them, and my mind was clearer now that I wasn't focusing on how much pain I was in. Come on, I muttered to myself. There's got to be something going on here. Once in a lifetime. Lunar calendar. Suddenly, from the corners of my brain, something that I hadn't remembered in years hit me. What was the only event more powerful, more dark than a new moon? The lunar eclipse. Chapter 5. Hank, Imelda's soft voice called over, and I felt a nudge on my paw. Hank, you look like you're lost in thought. I opened my eyes to find that the entire circle of nobles, witches, wizards, and werewolves alike were staring at me intently. You're right, I nodded. I was lost in thought. because I think I have something that might help us. Well, by all means, the king uttered. Don't keep it to yourself. I don't know what you would all call it here, I said. But in New Jersey we sometimes have a lunar eclipse. Everyone stared at me blankly, and then Sybil shook her head. No, the black-haired witch replied. I don't know what that is. Bother, the king said. Is this a phenomenon from New Jersey? Are the lords of New Jersey somehow behind this? No, I said quickly. It's not caused by anything in New Jersey, but it does relate to the phases of the moon. It happens in New Jersey every once in a while, but if it doesn't happen here very often, then that might explain why the moon goddess is so vulnerable. Do you guys keep track of the moon cycles over longer periods of time rather than just 1 month? Say over years at a time? Well, of course, the wizard nodded. To the best of our estimation, at least, we know the moon cycles, but we cannot predict the larger scale happenings that will occur in the solar system. Most of what we rely on in order to keep track of these things are what's visible. There's no NASA in Lupercalia, Tabitha said absent-mindedly before realizing what she'd revealed. No what? The wizard asked with a puzzled look. Where Hank is from, they have other ways of keeping track of the solar system, she said. But it doesn't matter right now. We need to focus on the events in our system. But surely it's the same system, the wizard asked as he looked at me. I was trying to figure out what to say when the door banged open behind me. I swiveled around to see who had entered the dining hall, and I was relieved to see that it was Charles, my old buddy and the noble of stock, in his hybrid wolf form. Perfect, Greyback called over. You've come at a perfect time, Charles. This place is empty, the knight said as he looked around. Did everyone else get banished in the time that I was gone? Most of the young knights and non-essential people were evacuated to one of the country estates after the storm, the king sighed. With the moat overflowing, we needed to be sure the knights could go where they were needed, and we wanted to be sure everyone else was safe. Now that things have settled down, the squires are recalling the knights, and thus we have this team of elderly knights. Charles smiled before he caught a glimpse of how cut up I was. Good goddess, Sir Henry, what on earth got to you? An undead bear, I answered. Charles, there's been a lot of developments on our hunt for the vampires, and they're not all good. I'd venture to say that none of them are good, Tabitha interjected. They spell trouble. Well, do tell, Charles said, and he pulled up a chair and sat beside me. By the way, Your Highness, I am here for the meeting to talk about land rights today. As the committee chairman, I arrived early, but I have a feeling that our priorities will be slightly different today. You're right, Charles, the king sighed. I must fetch a squire and make sure word is sent that the meeting is cancelled. I apologize for all these interruptions, gentlemen, but it is rather essential that we follow the correct protocol. Otherwise, there is going to be chaos in the castle. Of course, sire, I nodded. As the king called over another squire, I sighed. I was secretly a little bit peeved that we had to stop and start so often because of how the castle was run, but I understood that the more dangerous everything became, the more organized we had to become as well. Of course, sire, Dromgoole noted, and he scurried off. The meeting between nobles will not be happening tonight, Charles, the king said. Instead, they are invited to join our discussion if they please. The dining hall will be closed to the rest of the palace tonight. My goodness, Tabitha murmured to herself. The dining hall was never closed, except for emergencies in all my years of growing up here. I think that this certainly constitutes an emergency, the king replied. Oh, of course, Tabitha added, and a naughty smile crept across her face. You could take the cheeky girl out of the castle, but Tabitha was always going to have that hell-raising teenager somewhere inside her. Right, Charles said. Well, I'm not up to speed. What's been going on? Today we ventured to a vampire hideout that was shockingly close to the castle, I said. It was guarded by a zombified bear that must have been made by a similar process to that questing knight in the river. But this time it was guarding a laboratory that the vampires were using to keep track of the noble's blood. We think that they are planning an attack based on the phases of the moon. Exactly, the wizard said. Couldn't have said it better myself. Following the storm, both Sir Henry and I had a vision of the moon goddess, who told us that she was weak, the king added. But we aren't sure why. Thought perhaps she had been attacked by another immortal being, but Sir Henry was about to make another suggestion. Something to do with New Jersey. It's a phenomenon that sometimes happens in New Jersey, I said quickly. It's not something that the people of New Jersey actually control in any way. It's called a lunar eclipse. What exactly happens on this lunar eclipse? Charles asked, and he looked between the girls and me. Is it as frightening as the storm? It's a time when the moon moves into the Earth's shadow, I said. The moon's influence is completely nullified. And how often do these eclipses occur in New Jersey? The wizard said. I've read of such phenomena, but many scholars believe they're just stories. Well, it's every few years, I said. It's not as common as a new moon, but the moon becomes completely invisible, and the darkness. It's an ablation, Rorschach, Blue Claw interrupted. That must be what he is referring to, and we know what happens during an ablation of the moon. Wait, I said, and I held up both paws, which were covered in crusted up dried blood. Please explain what an ablation of the moon is? It's like the opposite of a holy day, Imelda murmured. They don't occur very often, and it's difficult to predict when they do. In fact, most of the time they are pinned to our worshipping patterns. When we've experienced insufficient crops or constant warfare, it's often viewed as a punishment. But now you're saying that they follow the lunar calendar? Rorschach added. And he raised an eyebrow and looked at me, because that would certainly change things. I am saying that there is a scientific underpinning to this, yes, I nodded. But it seems as if there's also a magical component, at least here in Lupercalia. Some of the worst battles in history have been fought on the night of an ablation, Greyback sighed. Some of the bloodiest and least successful. I heard the door slam again, and all of us looked back. Good evening, a knight named Clancy said. I've been told that the meeting is postponed so we may deal with a dangerous situation in the kingdom. Sir Henry, you look like you've been used as a dartboard. Something like that, Charles said as he stood up and shook the noble's hand. Clancy, do you have any memories of an ablation in our time? From when I was a boy, yes, the sandy-haired wolf said as he sat down at the round wooden table. There was a fire in the village. Nothing new there, Tabitha murmured. Seems it was a common occurrence around then. Clancy glared at her before remembering that Blue Claw was there and would probably have his head on a platter for a single word against his troublesome daughter. It's true, Greyback added. There is generally an upsurge in evil and dark activity in those times. Does anyone else have any evidence of this? Once 2 of our pigs were stolen on a particularly dark night, Sybil said. We had to send my brothers out far and wide to try and find them, but nobody could. Don't people steal things all the time? I asked. In Lupercalia? Greyback huffed. Most certainly not. Okay, I said and glanced at Sybil and Tabitha. One time, we were riding into battle against the lair of the silver-haired clan, Blue Claw mused. You remember that, don't you, Greyback? Like it was yesterday, he laughed. With no light from the moon. We had to hold torches. No light from the moon whatsoever, Tabitha's father laughed. And it was a catastrophe. Lost 2 strong, well-trained wolves during the battle. I had to bring their bodies back to the families, which is the worst part of being a knight by far. We won the battle against that clan, but it was hard won. Almost lost my direwolf. I am familiar with the silver-haired clan, Imelda admitted a little sheepishly. In my past life, of course. When they disappeared, we locked ourselves completely into hiding. How strange it is that we're companions now, Tabitha marveled as she patted the ex-vampire on the back. It's quite sexy, isn't it? All right, I said. So it seems like we all agree that there is an upsurge in criminal activity when the moon isn't full, and the smaller the moon, the more crime that takes place. This is probably because werewolves are weaker then. We can still fight, but the link to the moon goddess is very weak, so we don't heal as quickly. Yes, the king nodded. Yes, we've always been told that was true. I know. Several wizards have tracked that information for us. We have, Rorschach said and nodded. And what does all this recent strangeness indicate? Blue Claw asked. It seems to be a harbinger of doom, Charles replied. A warning about this. What did you call it? Lunar eclipse, I said. The ablation, the wizard replied. And if Sir Henry is right, then we need to determine exactly when this ablation will occur. If the goddess is in danger and the vampires are planning something, then we are weaker than ever. I could feel the old knights bristle at the assertion that we were weak in any way. It was a difficult pill to swallow, but we needed to know what we were up against. My slow-healing wounds were all the proof any of us needed that the goddess was indeed in trouble, and if the vampires were planning an attack, we wouldn't have much divine support in the upcoming war. Well, a vampire attack is hardly new, Clancy noted. We've fought them off before, we can do it again. But it's not just about fighting us, I said. They have a deeper purpose. That's why they were testing the blood. What are you saying? The king asked. The vampires' plan is to turn us, I said. That's their endgame. They don't want to just kill us, they want to turn us into vampires. They want us for their own, Greyback said with a shiver. To use for their dark ploys. And to convert the rest of the kingdom, Imelda added. Once the most powerful are converted, there's no hope for anyone else. And once everyone is a vampire, then the moon goddess has nobody to reign over. She is overthrown. These are dark times indeed, Charles added. But we can mobilize. Yes, the king murmured as he stared off into the distance. Yes, we must. I know the doctor is a sky watcher, Charles said. He has often said it was an important part of treating blue blood patients, and he can consult with the witches as well. Perhaps they can gather enough information to predict when this ablation will occur. Find the doctor then, Charles, the king replied. I'll make sure the questing knights return by first light. But what about tonight? I asked. You must heal, Hank, Charles said. Let your wonderful wives and Imelda take care of you. If we're going into battle, you need to be strong. You're one of our greatest assets, the king added. You must rest. I turned around and looked outside. It was completely dark, and although I could see a sliver of the moon in the distance, it was fingernail thin. Is there anything more we need to do tonight? I asked. I will need to summon the rest of the troops, the king said. It will be morning before the rest of the knights and soldiers arrive, so go and rest. Sir Henry, you can rejoin us then. Of course, sire, I said with a nod, and I stood up. Just as I did so, a flurry of fire seemed to race from my arms down my legs, and I thought that I was about to throw up from the pain. You okay, Hank? Sybil asked as she gave me a look of concern. Just a little stiff, I said as I willed my burning limbs to move. Nothing too serious. That's a good night, Blue Claw added as he slammed his fist on the table. I don't think I remember a day that I was as torn up as Sir Henry is right now. The goddess is certainly weaker than I've ever known her to be. Then I'll take the king's advice and let the healers tend to me, I said as I started to make my way out of the dining hall with the girls by my side. Sir Henry, I heard a familiar voice say, and I looked behind me to find Charles standing up as well. These dark times are unprecedented, but I don't know how we would have gotten this far without you. If you hadn't come along, we might have never known about Windroth's plan. I nodded at the knight who had given me so much assurance and guidance on my way to becoming a noble savior of Lupercalia. Now it was my time to show everyone just how much I was willing to fight for the kingdom. It's my honor, Charles, I said. And the rest of you. I will do everything in my power to fight these dark forces and keep them at bay. Even better, I want to vanquish them for good. It's what the people of Lupercalia deserve. Hear, hear, Blue Claw said, and he slammed his fist on the table. To the honor of our beautiful kingdom of Lupercalia, and to Sir Henry, who has done so much in his short time here to protect us from the dark forces. Hear, hear, the rest of them shouted, and the small group started to bang their feet against the floor. A small rumble emerged and echoed through the dining hall. It wasn't as overwhelming as when every noble in the kingdom was in one room, and it wasn't as loud as when we were in the jousting arena, but something about it was different. These were the top guys in the kingdom, and they were all rooting for me. I felt something touch my hand and looked down to find Tabitha squeezing me. Daughter of one of the most noble families in the kingdom was my wife, and now it was my job to make my family proud too. It was a hell of a lot of responsibility, but I couldn't wait. Chapter 7. Come in, I called as the girls started to hunt for their clothes. The door opened and Meredith stepped inside with a tray full of steaming cups of moonbean brew. The smell immediately calmed my nerves, and the girls made their way over and grabbed a few mugs. Sir Henry, ladies, the maid curtsied. We're back in action today. Can't let A storm shut us down every time it blows through, can we? Thank you so much, Meredith. Sybil smiled as she took a sip. Tabitha handed me a ceramic mug of the good stuff. I brought the warm mug to my lips and waited for the usual tingles to run down my spine. But this time when I swallowed it, there was a lag. In fact, it wasn't even a lag. I realized that I couldn't actually feel any of the usual effects of the Moon Bean brew beyond the usual good taste of the coffee. Meredith, Sybil said with a shaking voice. Did you do anything slightly different to the Moon Bean brew today? These beans were plucked just before the storm, Miss Sybil, the maid replied. They're the freshest batch we have. But none of us servants have tried them yet, Mississippi. We usually work our way through the previous batches and have preservation rooms for our own stock. Sybil and Tabitha shot me a look, and I felt a chill race down my spine. And this one wasn't from the moonbeans. Shit, I gurgled as I took the last swig from my mug. I could feel a rush of caffeine, but there was a certain magic that seemed to be missing from the beans this morning. Thank you, Meredith, Imelda said, and the maid curtsied again before making her way through the door. Hank, Sybil said, but suddenly Meredith's ruddy face popped back in and we all clammed up. Sir Henry, I forgot to say, the servant said, but your armor has been mended by the metal worker. You're all ready for battle or storm alike should you need it. Thank you ever so much, Meredith, I said and smiled. Meredith nodded and closed the door again, but this time we waited for a moment before anyone spoke. This tastes like piss, Tabitha said, and Sybil rolled her eyes. No, it doesn't, Tabitha, Sybil said. It tastes fine, but it's certainly not the moonbeam brew that I know and love. This moonbeam brew tastes watered down. You don't think they're up to something, do you? Tabitha asked with raised eyebrows. You know, trying to siphon more beans and then watering down the stock. I tried not to roll my eyes at the classic Tabitha reaction, which was so privileged that she thought to blame the staff before anything else. No, Sybil said as she shook her head. It tastes weak, but it's not from being watered down. The moonbeans they've been stripped of their magical properties, Imelda said, and she took another small sip and smacked her lips. Or not stripped per se, but they've definitely been diminished. Do you think it's because of the storm? She said that these were picked before the storm, I said. And I believe them. They're good servants, and we've given them a good life. They have no reason to trick us. So it's the beans, Tabitha nodded. The soil is weaker. It's because the moon goddess is weaker, Sybil croaked, and the girls all shared an anxious look. For a second I just looked into my mug and stared at the coffee grounds. I'd never been one to believe in things like voodoo, reading tea leaves, or consulting tarot cards, but I could swear that the shape from the dregs at the bottom of the mug formed an ominous swirl, like a puff of smoke designed to obscure anything that was behind it. Still, if you told me a year ago that I would have woken up to a raging storm in a far-flung medieval dimension as I lamented about weak coffee, I probably wouldn't have believed that either. I stared down into the coffee mug, and even though I didn't get the usual shot of energy from the moonbean brew, my mind started running laps around all the possibilities. If the moonbeans were even affected, it meant that the entire ecosystem of Lupercalia was starting to fail. This spelled trouble not just for my coffee dynasty back in New Jersey, but for every single noble and every single farmer in Lupercalia. Every crop would likely be affected, and that meant the economy would take a huge hit. I had no idea if Lupercalia had ever experienced a famine before, but it didn't seem so far-fetched at the moment. I knew that religious societies generally went into tumult when their systems of belief were thrown into doubt. However, this was different. The very tangible foundations of the land rested on their deity, and if she was ailing, the entire society was going to go with her. This would mean the end of Lupercalia. And even though it felt selfish to admit it, I was equally as worried for myself. Moonbean brew was the Henry Baker export. Even if I was a loyal savior of Lupercalia here in the land itself, I was still just Hank back in Jersey. Hank with a now multi-million-dollar business that would plummet without the stock that made him that rich in the first place. This wasn't just about Lupercalia. If the beans weren't magic anymore, then Moonbean Brewers was going down. I might as well be selling Joetown coffee. All right, I said, and I stood up. I could see the girls doing their best to keep their eyes locked on mine and not let them travel down my naked form, and it gave me a tiny jolt of Confidence amid the complete disaster at hand. Yes, Dick. Tabitha grinned. I mean Hank. Ha ha, I said in a flat voice. Okay, so this is obviously a catastrophe. For our business back in Jersey. I thought people from New Jersey loved watery, burnt coffee, Sybil said in a sweet and innocent voice. One of the shareholders from the New York summit told me that. I bet he did, I sighed. But this is going to change things. If Moon Bean Brew isn't special anymore, we won't be raking in millions. That means no mansion and no Uber Eats. Okay, Tabitha shrugged. Put me in armor. I don't care how pregnant I am, I will fight to the absolute death for Uber Eats, and so will your unborn child. No, they won't, I smiled. But I certainly will. And for the greater good of the noble kingdom of Lupercalia, of course. Girls, I'm going to find whoever is doing this, and I'm going to make sure that the moon goddess is restored to her rightful power. Okay, how does that sound? It sounds like war, Imelda said. And I'm ready for it. Imelda brushed her white hair out of her face and stretched her mouth so that her white, pointy teeth glistened in the light. She curled her hands and hissed in a terrifying way that made my stomach churn, and I knew that she was ready to fight. Gorgeous, I said. Perfect. I suppose we'll have to hear from the castle about our next moves, Imelda shrugged. But in the meantime we can prepare for the worst and wait with bated breath. Well, I'm certainly ready, Sybil announced, and she snapped her fingers to produce a small orange spark. I didn't even know that she could do that, but hell, my girls were surprising me with new tricks every single day. Hell fucking yeah, I nodded. We have the witches on board. And me three, Tabitha suddenly roared, and she lifted her mug in the air, before throwing it down and smashing it on the ground into smithereens. For a moment the other three of us just stared at the noble, who was grinning like a madwoman. I'd say it's the pregnancy hormones, Sybil whispered. But you are one crazy Lady Tabitha. To the House of Blue Claw, the blonde shouted, and then she turned around and rushed out of the bedroom. Someone is going to need to clean that up, I noted, just as another bolt of lightning cracked outside the window and lit up the whole room. Great goddess! Imelda gasped, and the priestess' big blue eyes looked like they had been pried open. We're going to have to do something about that. I'm going to get ready to travel, I said. You two should do the same, and make sure Tabitha is dressed for the weather before she leaves the house. Sometimes she's more trouble than she's worth, Sybil sighed as she and Imelda followed the noblewoman from the room. I chuckled and then turned my attention to my wardrobe, picked through the possibilities and finally settled on a black suede set that was supposed to be waterproof, though the storm would be a real test of that. I pulled on the shirt, leggings, and the toughest boots I had and then headed downstairs. My armor was in the same spot where I'd left it, though the holes, dents, and dings of the battle had been removed, and the metal shone in the candlelight. I shook my head as I pictured my hybrid form, and in an instant I was once again 9 feet tall and ready to bear the weight of the armor. Once I was sure all the pieces were tight, I pulled the moon sword from its sheath and held it up to the light. It still amazed me that I had forged this beautiful blade, though I had Charles to thank for the direwolf hilt that bore an uncanny resemblance to Casanova. Hank, Imelda said, and the priestess rushed out of the main living room to my left. She was carrying a massive tome, and she brought it up to my nose and pointed at a very complex-looking grid. It had been hand-drawn, but someone had taken great pains over the entire thing. The grid must have contained about 300 to 400 squares, and then I realized that it depicted every moon phase for an entire year. The moons were illustrated with black ink and silver paint, but I couldn't make out the runes at the top of the chart. What is this? I asked. Is this from this year? No, she said. This is 100 years ago. But look at how many of the squares are completely blacked out. I searched the chart and found that there were indeed a large amount of squares that had been blacked out, and the squares didn't seem to follow any distinct pattern either. What do they mean? I asked. I can't read the runes. They're not Lupercalian runes, Imelda said, and her blue eyes widened. Where did you get this volume from? I think it was a gift from the Blue Claws when we moved in, I said. 2 of the living room bookcases and all their contents came from the Blue Claw estate. Tabitha might know what's going on. Okay, thanks, Hank, Imelda muttered, and she scurried away up the stairs to try and find the noblewoman. Sure, I said and looked around the empty foyer. I could hear the servants in the kitchen and footsteps upstairs, but no one else had come to find me since Imelda had woken me. It was hard not to feel a little miffed since I was the one who was supposed to be riding into battle with the king. At least the storm was starting to fade, so maybe I wouldn't get drenched on the ride to the palace. Before I could decide my next move, Sybil appeared from the hallway that led to the kitchen. She had a bushel of herbs with blue flowers in her basket that looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't remember what they were supposed to be. For Hank, she said warmly. Where's Imelda? She just went upstairs to find Tabitha, I said. What are? But Sybil just nodded and raced up the stairs before I could finish my question. Man, these women were always up to something mysterious. But I'd known that would be true when I decided to marry 2 women and have another as a girlfriend. I'd certainly dealt with it often enough before the wedding ceremony. Sheesh, I sighed, and I took a few strides toward the staircase before a large unpleasant honking noise boomed from outside. Since I was in my hybrid form, my senses were much more powerful, and so what would normally have been a loud and irritating sound seemed more like an explosion. I covered my ears with my paws as the horn blast came to a weird end that kind of sounded like a kid making a fart noise with his lips. Coming. I heard Meredith call, and as I turned around I saw the maid was swinging the main door to the estate open. The door opened to reveal a tiny, sopping wet little man, who turned out to be Dromgoole. Despite looking as wet as a sponge, the squire still maintained a goofy smile, and he held a trumpet in his hand that was larger than he was. Oh my, I said. Come in, Dromgoole. That won't be an unnecessary. He started as he held up a quivering hand the size of a child's. The Ella Lupercalian custom. Get in here, Meredith said, and the maid scooped up the squire and planted him in the middle of the entrance hall before slamming the door shut. Girls, get some towels. Thank you, the squire stuttered as he shook, while 2 maids rushed forward with some clay-colored towels and wrapped up the tiny squire. My 3 girls emerged as well from their large closet with the book and an assortment of other little leather notebooks. They looked over the landing at the small squire, and Tabitha called out. Dromgoole, she said. What does the king have to say? As a summoning, he squeaked as the maids rubbed him dry. Something what? She demanded. Something good, bad, exciting? Summoning, the squire replied as he cleared his throat. It's a royal summoning. Every knight in the kingdom is needed, especially one of the stature of Sir Henry Baker. I volunteered to come here myself. And you certainly paid the price, Martha tut-tooted as she removed his deflated velvet hat. A summoning? I asked, and my eyes trailed up to Tabitha. I got the general gist of what was going on, but it was always good to have input from my specialist in all things noble. Yes, it's an emergency procedure, she said. It's what the king does when everything is going to shit. A complete levy of his feudal host. The maids' faces turned pink as they tried to abate their giggling, and Dromgoole the squire didn't make any mention of the swearing because he knew that he couldn't correct nobility. Yes, in a sense, Dromgoole said. When the rain has stopped completely, you must report to the castle. I would say to get dressed in your armor and have your weapons at the ready, but it seems as if you already knew what to do. I'm just going off of my instincts, I said as I glanced out the nearest window. Even though the thunder and lightning had stopped, thick droplets were still pounding the stairs. I wondered why the king was waiting for the storm to die down when such an important undertaking was at hand. Dromgoole, do stay for a cup of Moon Bean brew, Martha said as she scurried off into the kitchen. If you insist, the squire replied cheerfully. Dromgoole, I said. I don't care about the rain. Are you sure I shouldn't go now? The witches say it won't last the hour, Dromgoole said. And they know the ways of the skies. So everyone is just supposed to wait for the weather to clear? I asked in disbelief. A storm like this one makes for difficult travel, even for the best knights. And they're direwolves, the squire replied. And there are already knights in the castle. The rest are expected this afternoon. The king. Dromgoole paused like he wasn't sure how much he could safely reveal. He glanced at the maids, who gathered the wet towels and left after a few more giggles. The king was concerned that so many knights traveling at the same time would invite an ambush, Dromgoole whispered. But if the arrivals are staggered, it would make it more difficult for someone to know where and when to attack. Ah, I said with a nod. So it's tactical. Exactly, the squire said as Meredith rushed back with some moonbean brew. So kind, Dromgoole purred as he accepted the mug. I have a request, Tabitha said as she marched down the stairs with Sybil and Imelda just behind her. Would it be possible to whip up some pickled leeks? With cream. Pickled leeks with cream? The maid asked, and she blinked a few times in shock. Whatever for? To eat, ma'am, Tabitha said. I desire pickled leeks and cream. Then pickled leeks and cream shall be served, Miss Tabitha. The maid nodded, and she rushed off to the kitchen. With some rosemary syrup, too, Tabitha called after her. That sounds awful, Tabitha, Sybil said as she wrapped an arm around the noblewoman's waist. I am only being creative, Tabitha sighed. And now that we know Hank is leaving for a summoning, I can't think of anything but food. I'm sorry. I'm scared. I had never seen Tabitha admit vulnerability like that before, but it was certainly a change-up. It also sounded like her pregnancy cravings were going completely off the rails. Don't be scared, Tabitha, I said with a smile. I'm the most precocious knight in Lupercalia. That's what I'm worried about, she said. Well, I'll hardly be the only knight there, I pointed out. And this time, I'll have the support of people like your dad and old Greyback. They've fought in battles like these before, and I'm sure they'll have some good advice on how to stay alive. I know, Hank, Tabitha sighed, but it's a lot to handle. I'll hold down the fort, Sybil assured me. We'll continue our research on ablations and we'll send word as soon as we have news. Thank you, Sybil, I said. I believe in you, Hank, Imelda said, and she took my big paws in her small, pale hands. You saved me, and I know that you're going to do the same for all of Lupercalia. There's no other knight like you. There certainly isn't, Tabitha added. Oh, don't mind me, Dromgoole blubbered. This is the best part of being a squire. You knights work so very hard for the kingdom. It pains me to tear you away from your families. Don't be silly, I said. This is my job. Meredith rushed back in with a blue bowl in her hands, and with my super wolf senses I could pick up on the pretty dank combination which formed a kind of green-purple goo in the bowl. Delicious, Tabitha mumbled, and she snatched a spoon from the maid and started shoveling the ungodly concoction into her mouth. Why, Miss Tabitha, Meredith said. With a snack like that, if I didn't know any better, I'd say you were tasteless, Sybil interrupted her with a smile and a shrug. I know to think a woman from the Blueclaw family would want to munch on something so vile. Speak for yourself, Tabitha said through a mouthful. I think that I am quite masterful. Right? I sighed and glanced out the window again. The rain was little more than a light drizzle, which meant it was time to head to the palace. This was my calling as a werewolf knight, and it was time for me to answer it. Let's go, I said to the squire. I can summon the direwolf along with my pony, Dromgoole said. It's the least I can do as a squire in the house of a noble. Okay, Dromgoole, I said as the tiny squire rushed out of the house. Finally, it was just me and the girls. It was going to be hard to say goodbye to them, but there was no option but to fight. Lupercalia was in more danger than ever, and if the moon goddess went down, so did our entire livelihood. I'll pray for your protection, Sybil said. And take this. The witch started to rifle through her green dress with her long, elegant hands. After a moment, she produced a small wooden carving of a pig that was the size of a bead. I never knew that dress had pockets, Tabitha said with wonderment. My brother whittled this for me for good luck and protection, she said. Take it. I looked down at the tiny pig in my gauntlet and thought of Prometheus, who was probably taking a snooze behind Casanova's ear right about then. I felt bad that I'd have to take the direwolf away from him, but my duty called. Thanks, Sybil, I said, and I placed the tiny pig in my sack. I promise I'll make you proud. We know you will, Tabitha said with a wink. By the goddess, protect the noble savior, Imelda muttered to herself, and she kissed both of her hands before placing them on my paw. I know she is weak, but I can still summon some of her energy. Thank you, I said, and I smiled at the girls for one last time before a small knock came from the front door. Sir Henry, Dromgoole said, I have Casanova as well as my own pony, Digit. We must ride now to the castle. Of course, I said, and I took one last glimpse of the girls before leaving. Imelda still glowed, even though I could sense the nervous energy pulsating off of her. Her white robes glittered in the gray light of the sky, and she waved goodbye. Tabitha took another spoonful of her gross medley before putting her fist across her heart in a gesture of loyalty. I knew that even though she was struggling to hold it together, she was keeping up her usual tough exterior so that she didn't completely crack. Sybil pulled her long black silky hair out of her face and gave me a wink. There was worry in her sparkling green eyes, but there was a fierce determination there as well. She would keep the estate running smoothly and still have time to investigate the ablations, and I knew that my home would be safe as long as she was there. I nodded to my ladies and then climbed onto Casanova's back. I looked around for Dromgoole and spotted the squire a few yards away. Despite the distance, the white and gray dappled pony he was on pranced nervously. "Will Digit be okay if we ride together?" I asked. "He'll be fine," Dromgoole assured me and patted the pony's neck. "He just doesn't know Casanova very well, but once we're on our way back to the palace, he'll settle down." With that, we raced out of the estate and into the fields and pastures of Lupercalia. Even the green hills and dales seemed more gray than usual, and it felt like the whole countryside had caught a cold. Casanova treaded carefully but quickly, and we soon lost Dromgoole and Digit. After all, there was just no way that a pony had the same kind of power or speed as a direwolf. "Good boy, Casanova," I said and urged him to run faster. The castle appeared in the distance, but with my wolf vision I noticed that the flags were different. Rather than the usual blue, white, and yellow, the flags were a deep red shade with several black dots. I took this to mean that there must be some kind of danger to the kingdom, because I'd never seen those colors before on the castle flags. The drawbridge was as busy as a feast day. There were 5 mounted knights in front of me, but instead of the usual routine of squires collecting the direwolves while the knights headed for the hall, the guards were directing everyone to the chapel. When we reached the front, though, a large spear swooped down to block our path. "Sir Henry the baker," the guard's voice boomed, "you have been summoned to the private office of the king." A squire I didn't recognize, who was dressed in red and black velvet, came and took a hold of Casanova's reins. "But," I said, "I have been summoned. I was called by a squire." "Your desire to fight is noble," the guard said in a flat, unaffected voice. "But your king has summoned you." I felt a mild twitch in my stomach as I looked at the other knights gathered around me. I wanted to be on the front lines of a battle, but I couldn't exactly shirk the king's orders if that wasn't what he wanted me to do. "Sir Henry?" the squire asked as he tugged slightly at Casanova's reins. "Did you hear?" Yes, I murmured, and I shook my head as I slid off of Casanova's body. Just as I reached the ground, I heard clip-clopping on the drawbridge and I saw Dromgoole and Digit trot up. I felt annoyed that the squire hadn't told me more about the summons back at the estate, but he was probably just following his orders. I watched Dromgoole leap off the pony with an impressive agility that I never would have expected from a squire, especially given how heavily he was panting. "Come," Dromgoole wheezed, and he started to make his way toward the back right-hand corner of the stone courtyard. "We must go to the offices of the king." "Dromgoole," I said as I followed him down a dark, torchlit hallway. "Why? Didn't you tell me that I had to go straight to the offices? I thought that I'd be joining the others in the field." "I don't have all the answers, Sir Henry," he sighed. "I only have orders. Anyway, follow me closely because we're taking a back route and I don't want to lose you." I don't think I'd ever accessed any part of the castle from a direct route, so I knew that I was in for a ride if even Dromgoole thought it was confusing. We ducked past the doctor's room, which was the first place I'd ever been in the castle, and then after making a sharp right into an unlit hallway, Dromgoole knocked on a gremlin that had been carved into the stone. Suddenly, the wall opened to reveal that it was a door, where another squire was on duty. "Drum," the new squire said with a low nod. "Ah, you have Sir Henry. Good. This king has been waiting." Dromgoole nodded as we swept through the hidden door into a warm, dark hallway, lit by torchlight. We were definitely in the interior of the castle because it smelled like mulch and dust, and the walls felt thick and heavy. The squire led me up a narrow flight of spiral stairs before we came to a large wooden door, which Dromgoole knocked on exactly 5 times. The door swung open, and the king was standing right before me in his hybrid form. He was wearing a practical blue velvet robe that came to just above his feet, and there was nothing to mark him as the king except a yellow moon embroidered in a very fine silver thread onto the front of his tunic. The king nodded at Dromgoole, who took a few steps, and then the leader of Lupercalia took me by the paw and pulled me into his office. "Sir Henry," the king said as he shut the door with Dromgoole outside, "I am so glad that you have arrived." "Of course, sire," I said as I bowed before him, "but if I might add, I'm a bit confused. I assumed that I would be joining the other knights of the realm as they prepared for battle." "Yes, as you would," the king said, "but something else has occurred and I believe that you might be the only knight I can rely on to fix it." I bristled for a moment, but I finally nodded. "I will do whatever needs to be done," I murmured as a feeling of dread crept my spine. "You may want to sit down," the king suggested. "This is not an easy thing to hear." I took a deep breath. It seemed impossible that things could get any darker. But it looked like that's exactly what I was about to find out. Chapter 8. As the king stepped to the side, I was surprised to find that there was another young-looking knight in the room. I heard the king sigh softly, and then he waved me toward one of the other chairs. The strange knight sat on one of the dark blue velvet chairs that the king seemed to favor. He had chestnut brown fur and was wearing the castle-issued armor of a questing knight, and when he saw me, his dark brown eyes widened in recognition. He stood up and bowed his head as if I was the ruler in this place. "Sir Henry," the young knight said in what sounded like the voice of a teenage boy, "noble savior of Lupercalia, it is an honor to meet you." "I'm sorry I didn't see you earlier," I said. "I didn't realize that the king and I weren't alone in the room." "No worries, Sir Henry," the king said. "I put him in the shadows so he could recover. But this is young Arthur. As you can see, he is a questing knight. But I believe that his story may be of some interest to you." "Of course," I said as I finally sat down in one of the blue velvet chairs. "Great to meet you, Arthur." "Oh, thank you, sir," the young knight said in a nervous voice. I didn't want to toot my own horn, but I knew that it must be quite a rare privilege for a questing knight to meet someone with my stature, to say nothing of a private audience with the king. He seemed nervous, but I also guessed that this had to do with the mission he just returned from. "Tell Sir Henry exactly what you told me," the king ordered him. "In the exact same detail. Even more detail if you can stomach it, boy." "Yes, sire," the knight replied, and he looked up at me with a sliver of fear in his eyes. "We're all ears," the king prompted when the knight didn't continue. Arthur took a deep breath and then turned to me. "Right," the questing knight said. "Sir Henry, I am sure that you are familiar with the forest of Thoth." I thought back to my Lupercalian forests. Before becoming a knight, geography had never been my strong suit, but since I had to travel pretty much everywhere by direwolf now, I was more than versed in the terrain. "Yes," I nodded in response. "I don't live terribly far away from the forest of Thoth. In fact, I went on my very first quest as a knight in that forest, which is where I met one of my wives." "How lucky for you, sir," Arthur nodded. "This is where I also went on my first quest. I was sent with a companion, my dear friend Walter, and we had high hopes of achieving success like yours." Suddenly, the atmosphere in the room ran cold. I could tell that something was amiss, and the king hung his head low and shook it. "Dear Walter Shutyard," the king sighed. "From the noble house of Shutyard. That poor family. May the goddess rest his soul," Arthur added reflexively. "It sounds to me as if something happened to your friend," I said to the young knight. "I'm very sorry to hear that. We're trained in such matters," the knight shrugged. "We know from our first lesson that this is not work for the faint-hearted, nor those who cannot rise to the deadly and risky nature of the job." Walter was aware of this, but he swore he would fight to the death for his kingdom and his family, and that is what he did. Even though I no longer have him by my side, I am glad that he died with honor. "Yes," I nodded. "Yes, that is very honorable." "Go on, Arthur," the king said. "Sir Henry doesn't even know the nature of the mission you were on. You must go back further, to the beginning." Yes, the knight nodded. "Sir Henry, we were assigned a mission to venture into the forest of Thoth. In the eastern end there is a vampire coven that has taken over one of the dilapidated smokehouses. The place was even still full of meat. It was a ghastly location. It was only abandoned some 10 Years ago, but the vampires have made it their home. I nodded. Yes, I am familiar with this. The vampires take over the properties by killing the owners and then refusing to leave. Exactly, Arthur said. And aside from this, the Forest of Thoth is also home to other criminals. There are outlaws and brigands who hide in the woods and they attack any unsuspecting soul who ventures into the forest without proper protection. I met my wife through such criminal activity, I said, and I saw the young knight furrow his brow. My Sybil was about to be attacked by a few brigands who were looking to rob her of lamb's ear sage before I stepped in. It's a tragedy how often things like that happen in Thoth, Arthur said and nodded. Yes, the king sighed. Most local authorities are aware of such activity, and they are supposed to be responsible for that. But it has now become a prime training ground for questing knights because no one else seems to be able to do anything about the anarchy. But go on, Arthur. Of course, the young knight said. Now here is when the story becomes tricky. How so? Well, the knight said and then paused. Honestly, I wasn't sure if I should even return to the palace to make my report because I wasn't sure if what I witnessed was truly strange or not. I didn't want to waste the king's time with something that was perfectly ordinary. It is strange, the king said, and I am glad that you had the foresight to consult me. The two men seemed to be skirting around something uncomfortable, even if they weren't trying to. It was like the young knight wanted to say it, but couldn't bring himself to do so because it was either too ghastly or too difficult. What do you mean strange? I asked. The vampires were strange? Walter and I managed to fight off most of the vampires, Arthur said. For all I know, there may have been even more that weren't in the coven at the time of our attack, which is why I won't speak in absolutes. We had slain all of the vampires that we found, even though Walter lost his life. I barely got out alive myself, but I wanted to keep fighting to fight them to the death until I had properly avenged my friend. Otherwise, I couldn't have returned in good conscience. And you will be rewarded for your stunning bravery, the king said. But tell Hank what you saw. Well, it's difficult to describe, the knight said as he stared into the distance. At first, we thought that it was a normal raid. We would go in, slay the beasts and leave. And in a way, that's how it started. I went in, slayed the beasts and left, albeit without my friend. But the place was littered with paintings on the wall, and someone had set up a kind of altar. My father once brought me to an abandoned coven house when I was a pup, and I was expecting it to be dilapidated and dirty. You've seen a coven house before, haven't you? Of course, I nodded. Several times. They're always putrid and covered in blood and gore. Exactly, the knight nodded. When my father had successfully completed a raid, he brought me to one, and that was what I was expecting. But there was a sense of order about this place. And the vampires all had the same symbol burnt into their head. That's not common, is it? I've never seen anything like that, I murmured as the king nodded in agreement. I have never heard of such a thing, the king said. And you said that the vampires were all equally strong. Yes, he nodded. There was no leader involved. It seemed like they had been democratic about sharing the blood supply, which I thought was odd. I'd always been told that each coven had a leader who kept most of the blood for himself and nearly starved the other vampires. That's why the strategy is to focus on the leader and destroy him first and then destroy the rest of the coven. But we couldn't figure out who the leader was. I've never heard of that, I said. When I killed Windroth, he was obviously the leader. He would use and abuse other vampire bodies in order to get his supply of blood. They'd wander through the forest looking for food, and they would slowly start to go insane from the starvation. And that's why they always seemed so weak. These vampires were far from weak, the knight said, and his voice seemed to get quieter as his eyes glazed over. Watching your best friend getting maimed by a vampire was no easy experience, and I had a feeling that he would mentally wear the battle scars from this first mission as long as he lived. Arthur, the king prompted gently. Yes, the knight said as he shook his head and made eye contact with me. Again. Yes. It seemed like there was a more coordinated effort than we were expecting, but I was too busy trying to get Walter's body out and keeping watch on my own safety to investigate further. I had to fight for my life. I believe you, Arthur, I assured him. Hank, you have had some strange encounters with the vampires recently. The king said. You've also shown enough bravery and skill to defeat them. Sire, I said. I would love to be of assistance. But I've never heard of a case like this. None of the vampires I encountered behaved remotely similar to what Arthur is describing. I know, the king said. Which brings me to my next point. I would like you to investigate this coven and make sure that the vampire clan are completely dead and gone. As Arthur said, there may still be some stragglers. And furthermore, I want you to gather all the information you can about this coven. Take in the shrines, the symbols, everything that young Arthur has described. Make a note of them if you have to. I want to know exactly what's going on there and whether it will be of any significance in our upcoming battle. For a second I froze. I was actually being sent on a special mission with no backup, while every other knight was mobilizing to wage a battle of dramatic proportions. I mean, I was obviously flattered. I knew that I could pull it off, but it seemed like one of the riskiest times to do so. My scars from the previous battle had only just healed, so I was going to have to be careful now that the moon goddess was in her weakened state. I won't let you down, sire, I nodded. I promise. Very good, the king nodded. Arthur, hand over your map with the coordinates. Sire, it's... Arthur started, and then he shot a look between me and the king, before taking a deep breath and producing a scroll from his canvas sack. The scroll was tightly wound, but it was covered in dark blue dried blood. I winced slightly when I thought of what the young knight had gone through, and I felt a kind of pity when he placed it in my hands. Sorry that it's dirty, he whispered. It's not dirty, I replied. It's a mark of honor and valor. The knight nodded and looked down, but not before I saw a tear trickle down his cheek. I opened the map while Arthur gathered himself, and I was happy to see that the knight had made a detailed map. I realized that the coven's location was a straight shot from the stock chapel, and it wouldn't take more than an hour to get there if the weather wasn't as stormy as before. You're very brave, Arthur, I said as I rolled up the map. I'm sorry about what you had to see. But not every questing knight returns the body of their dead friend, the king said, and he put his hand on Arthur's shoulder. That was a brave thing, young Arthur, and one his family will appreciate. It was only right, sire, Arthur said as he looked up at the king. It was the least I could have done for his family. And for your brave efforts, the king said. You will be rewarded 2 horse worth of moon silver, to be put toward the establishment of your own orchard. I was told by your father, the Duke, that you desire nothing more. And after only this first mission, I have full faith that not only will you successfully complete many more quests, but you will do so with the same honor and grace that saw you through this mission. For a second, the young knight only stared at the king, and then his jaw slowly dropped when the amount of the reward actually sank in. Sire, he said with a laugh as he shook his head. Sire, that is incredibly kind of you. Not kind, the king said, but warranted. You were sent to a dangerous location, you succeeded, and you showed your friend and his memory the honor they deserve. You are being rewarded in accordance with your work and your courage. It's only the Lupercalian way, isn't it, Sir Henry? The king looked at me, and his eyes twinkled. Even though the entire kingdom was mobilizing for a battle, I couldn't help but feel my heart warm at the king's reward for Arthur. I had gained everything I had from this land, and I knew that this young knight seemed incredibly precocious in his own way as well. I think you'll go far, Arthur, I said, and I can't wait to hear about each of your adventures. Now run along, the king said, and the young knight bowed at the both of us, with a new spring in his step. I'll ask that you not discuss the details of the coven with anyone else for now. Not a word, Arthur promised. And I think you've earned a chance to recover, the king added. Your summoning will be tomorrow. Thank you, sire, Arthur said and bowed. And Sir Henry, it was an honor to meet you. The knight glanced at the 2 doors, but then one of them popped open and the small figure of a squire briefly appeared. Arthur bowed again and then followed the squire into the dark hallway just beyond. The door swung shut a moment later, and the king sighed as he dropped into his chair. I really do think he'll go far, the king replied. I agree, I said. But why do I feel like there's more you want to tell me? You should have seen the boy when he arrived, the king said. One of his ears had to be sewn back on by a witch. He'd carried it in his gauntlet. Could you imagine? I'm not sending him into battle immediately. He needs at least a day to process what he saw back there and to recover his strength. Of course, sire, I nodded. That's very kind of you. Only practical, he shrugged. The mind is just as powerful as the body in these circumstances. One needs to be strong with faith and trust, but those can be hard to find when the goddess feels so far away. I agree, sire, I said. And as for this mission, I'm afraid that time is of the essence, Sir Henry, he said. You must go immediately, and if you can be back by nightfall, that would be ideal. I will try my very best, sire, I said, and I will make note of everything that I find. That's a good night, he murmured. So I will see you later without a shadow of doubt. We simply don't have the luxury to meditate on anything but success. That's true, I said as I stood up. I placed the blood-stained map in my sack, and then slung it over my shoulder. I nodded to the king, who gave a tired wave in reply, and then opened the door I'd used earlier. Thankfully I found Dromgoole just on the other side. I wasn't eavesdropping, he assured me. I was only staying at my station. It's required of a squire, if they have escorted. Don't worry, I smiled. I'm glad you're still here. I don't think I could find my way out of here without you. But I have to head out as soon as possible, so if you could just... Of course, Sir Henry, he said, and he started to scuttle down the hallway. We made our way down the spiral stairs, through another hallway, came to the same squire who guarded the secret entrance, and down another dark hallway. By the time we reached the courtyard, word must have spread that I would need my direwolf, because Casanova was already by the drawbridge. The pup blinked up at me with his big green eyes and panted as I walked over. I knew he loved an adventure just as much as I did, and I was grateful that we got to spend some time together on a mission as just the two of us. Come on, Cass, I said as I hopped on the wolf and patted his head. We've got a mission of our own to finish before we get to join the others. Casanova let out a big sigh, because I'm sure that he had been just as excited as me to join the battalion on the field. But we had our own special mission to complete, and it was far more important than joining the rest of the knights. Don't worry, I laughed as I gave him a nudge over the drawbridge. We'll be back in time for supper. I aimed Casanova toward the village of Stock in the distance, where I could see some smoke rising out of a few of the chimneys. Even under this kind of threat, I knew that the people of Lupercalia were strong and stalwart, and they would be able to weather the storm until we defeated the evil that had emerged. Casanova slowly gained speed as he pounded the ground toward the village and, in turn, the forest of Thoth. Despite his speed, it was hard not to notice how lackluster the fields were. Even the air was unsettled, and the normally brilliant yellow light of the sun was now a light gray. Dark gray and white swirls filled the sky and made me feel like I was being suffocated. Though it wasn't raining anymore, the darkness was still foreboding as hell, and I urged Casanova to an even faster pace. Before I knew it, the town had disappeared behind me. The ground was still wet, but Casanova had managed to run through the hills and dales without slipping. We passed a few errant farmhouses until the first trees of the forest of Thoth started to appear in the distance. I took a deep breath when I realized that we would be plunged into even more darkness than we were already in. Okay, I said. Let's fucking go. Casanova tore through the clearing that led from the grassy fields to the forest. I looked around at the shimmering dirt that Thoth was known for, and took in the seeming tranquility of the dark woods. The birds and the insects continued to hum in the trees as we sprinted into the darkness, and I wondered if they could feel the changes in the atmosphere as well. There certainly seemed to be a more frantic note to their songs, though I could have been imagining it. I tugged ever so slightly on Casanova's right rein in order to direct him to the precise location, and we bowled through the trees until we were nearly to the old smokehouse. I pulled back on the reins, and Casanova dropped down to a quick trot and then started to pad through the woods. The first indication that we were close was a strong stench that seemed to come out of nowhere. It wasn't exactly like the other vampire houses. Instead, it was like old fish in fire. It was pretty damn obvious that we were in the vicinity of the smokehouse, and I pressed Casanova forward as we followed our noses. All of the sudden, Casanova stopped dead in his tracks. What is it, boy? I asked, and the dog gestured his head to the left and scratched at the dirt with his paws. I looked up and between a few trees I saw a big dark wood barn. This is it, boy, I murmured to the direwolf. Looked like we'd found our location. Now we just had to get to the bottom of whatever the hell Arthur had seen